such as lemon, bayabas, oregano that can help heal different sicknesses and help us live longer. If we don't protect biodiversity, many species of organisms will be lost forever. In our country, there are groups of scientists who study different species of living things and help in conserving them. It is hard to imagine Earth without the diversity of animals and plants. So we must all join hands to help protect and preserve the biodiversity of life now. There are so many different living things around us. On land, different kinds of trees and plants grow in the forests where a variety of animals live. Under the sea, millions of different fishes, corals, and seashells live. In the air, birds of various sizes, shapes, and colors abound. The variety and differences among living things is called biological diversity. Biological diversity is the variety of life on Earth. It has 3 levels. 1. Species diversity. Species is the fundamental unit of diversity. It refers to the different kinds of living things on Earth, like animals or plants. 2. Genetic diversity. It relates to the different kinds of organisms of the same species. For example, the palay where we get rice. There are so many kinds of palay. For each species of an animal, there can be unique differences of each individual. This happens because of their unique genetic makeup. And 3. Ecosystems diversity. Ecosystem refers to where organisms live, where they live on water or on land. The more ecosystems, the greater the biodiversity. There are between 30 to 100 million species on Earth, but only 1.7 million have so far been identified. Is biodiversity important? Yes, it is. First, it provides us food, water, and clean air to keep us active and alive. Second, it provides us different sources of medicines from herbs and plants such as lagundi, bayabas, oregano that can help heal different sicknesses and help us live longer. If we don't protect biodiversity, many species of organisms will be lost forever. In our country, there are groups of scientists who study different species of living things and help in conserving them. It is hard to imagine Earth without the diversity of animals and plants. So we must all join hands to help protect and preserve the biodiversity of life now. There are so many different living things around us. On land, different kinds of trees and plants grow in the forests where a variety of animals live. Under the sea, millions of different fishes, corals, and seashells live. In the air, birds of various sizes, shapes, and colors abound. The variety and differences among living things is called biological diversity. Biological diversity is the variety of life on Earth. It has three levels. 1. Species diversity. Species is the fundamental unit of diversity. It refers to the different kinds of living things on Earth, like animals,
Hello. Hello. Okay na. Mag-start tayo. Okay. Hi everyone, just a few reminders before we start. Please make sure to turn off your mic and video to avoid disruption during the lecture session. And if you have questions to our speakers, please make use of the chat box and we will read them later one by one. Moreover, please be reminded that the certificates will be sent via email upon completion of the evaluation form that will be given at the end of the lecture. We will start the program in a short while.
or plants. 2. Genetic diversity. It relates to the different kinds of organisms of the same species. For example, the palay where we get rice. There are so many kinds of palay. For each species of an animal, there can be unique differences of each individual. This happens because of their unique genetic makeup. And 3. Ecosystems diversity. Ecosystem refers to where organisms live, where they live on water or on land. The more ecosystems, the greater the biodiversity. There are between 30 to 100 million species on Earth, but only 1.7 million have so far been identified. Is biodiversity important? Yes, it is. First, it provides us food, water, and clean air to keep us active and alive. Second, it provides us different sources of medicines from herbs and plants such as lagundi, bayabas, oregano that can help heal different sicknesses and help us live longer. If we don't protect biodiversity, many species of organisms will be lost forever. In our country, there are
Start na. Okay na. Hello. Hi again, everyone. I am Eman, and I'll be your host for this day. Just last month, as a postscript to the World Wildlife Day, the National Museum of the Philippines concluded LIPI lecture series, The Philippine Ornithology and Lifeworks of Dr. Hector Miranda. We got to learn an avifauna research and just be amazed by the stunning lifeworks and stories from Dr. Miranda himself. And if you enjoyed it last time, I'm sure you'll also love this one. In celebration of the Earth Month this April, the Museum of the Philippines newly presents the NMP Talks, where we make science a culture for the people. This will feature our researchers and affiliates to share their expertise and knowledge to the general public. And for our first talk, we are lucky to hear from one of our National Museum research affiliate, Mr. Movin Naya Sengeran and Dr. Tan Yen Yi from the National University of Singapore. But before we officially start the program, we would like to acknowledge our participants joining us here on Zoom today. Our friends from Benguet State University, Polytechnic University of the Philippines, University of the Philippines, Visayas State University, Western Mindanao State University, Oriental Bird Club, Energy Development Corporation, and of course, our friends from the National University of Singapore and Lee Kong Chan Natural History of Museum. And to everyone else who made the time and effort to join us here in this event. So without further ado, to formally welcome us and open the program, may I call the Deputy Director General for Museums, Mr. Jorel M. Legaspi. A round of applause, everyone.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to our very first edition of our new educational program, NMP Talks. This platform is designed for our researchers, collaborators, NMP research affiliates and associates, and fellows to share their expertise and studies with the public through lectures and discussions. As an educational, cultural, and scientific institution, our aim is to make collaborative research and studies accessible to the public. Our zoology division, led by Ms. Marvin Santos, initiated the NMP Talks series. Today, we feature our research affiliate from the National University of Singapore, Mr. Movin Nyana Sengeran. I hope I said your name right. Welcome. And Dr. Tan Yen Lee, our collaborator from the National University of Singapore. They will discuss Philippine biogeography and natural history collections this afternoon in timely celebration of Earth Month this April. We are challenged to protect planet Earth and help raise awareness about the conservation of our ecosystem and organisms. So like day in and day out, we are reminded that the climate is changing, and with rising temperatures as we're experiencing this summer, we have daily reminders of that and the importance of being able to learn how we can help contribute to taking care of our environment. This afternoon's discussion is crucial as it seeks to deepen our understanding of our country's biogeography and extensive natural heritage. Successful biodiversity conservation depends on the urgency and knowledge of what to do in order to contribute to conservation. Our researchers' fieldwork and the ecological studies conducted by our field biologists are the starting point of our goal to protect the Earth and all its inhabitants. I look forward to your participation in the discussion later. Don't hesitate to learn from the wisdom of our resource persons and take inspiration from their work. Our country needs more naturalists, biologists, and conservationists so that we can better protect our natural heritage. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to see all of you at our next NMP Talks and meet you very soon at the National Museum of the Philippines here at the National Museum of Natural History. Good afternoon and happy Earth Month.
Thank you, Sir Jorel. And may I also call Mr. Rolly Oriza, the Senior Museum Researcher from the Zoology Division, to introduce our speaker for today. Sir Rolls.
Good afternoon. It's my honor to introduce our first speaker. So Mobin is a researcher from the National University of Singapore, and he is passionate about biogeography and conservation. His primary focus at present is working with partners to obtain a better understanding of the species limits and centers of endemism for birds of the Philippine mountains. He hopes that this will provide a firmer roadmap for conservation in the archipelago and help highlight specific areas in need of intervention to ensure the preservation of full suite of bird species here. While not conducting fieldwork on remote mountains peak, he can be found tending to his many fish tanks and or working baking cakes at home. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, Mobin Nyana Sengaran.
Thank you, Rolly. Thank you, Director General. Thank you, Director of Zoology, Marvin. Thank you so much for the overwhelming, positive introductions. I hope I live up to it. So I'm here, my name is Movin. I'm a researcher from the National University of Singapore from the Avian Evolution Lab. I'm working on my PhD right now, and my focus is really on a better understanding of... okay, sorry, I'm a little bit tall. Okay, so thank you, first of all, thank you so much for everything. My name is Movin. I am a researcher from the National University of Singapore. I'm a research affiliate with the National Museum of Manila. And my focus is really on getting a better understanding of the birds, specifically the high elevation montane birds in the Philippine archipelago. But today my talk will have a little bit of that, but it's really going to be a broad overview on the biogeography of the Philippines. So a much broader overview on patterns of diversity that we see and distribution of species on these islands. So first of all, we're going to start off with an endemic species that is quite common throughout the Philippines, except for Palawan, the white-throated kingfisher, or also called the brown-breasted kingfisher, depending on whom you ask. This is a species that's actually quite ubiquitous and found throughout many towns and many urban areas, places where a lot of people are in the Philippines. You can probably find one in Rizal Park that's just like a stone, that's where we're in actually, the museum is actually located in right now. And so this is important because I just wanted to show and sort of explain that endemism and having species found nowhere else in the world is ubiquitous to the Philippines. You can live your life day to day, you can walk around where you stay, and you're probably going to come across some birds or animals that are only ever going to be found in the Philippines. And that basically underpins the importance of conserving biodiversity in the archipelago. So first of all, before we go on a tangent to talk about biogeography, we need to talk about speciation. What is speciation? Speciation is how one thing becomes two or more species, right? And so there are requirements for it. Number one, a population needs to be separate. It needs to be isolated from each other. And this isolation needs to be coupled with a long time. You need a long time where there is no gene flow or an exchange of reproduction between these populations. And without these two ingredients, you cannot have speciation. And so to help with that, let me talk a little bit more about isolation. So isolation here specifically refers to reproductive isolation. That means that the individuals in the two different populations, they're not actually mating with or breeding with or resulting in progeny in the next generation. There's no gene flow. And what this means is that each population now is going on its own evolutionary trajectory. This means that any unique traits that each population has, these are going to be amplified and magnified generation after generation. And this is what makes them more and more different as time passes by. Introgression, what I mean here is introgression is breeding between populations. It homogenizes differences, right? So differences that were very pronounced before when these populations were apart, when they start breeding with each other, these differences become less pronounced, they become less obvious. You get more intermediacy. Like for example, if one population were blue and one population were red, when they start intergressing, maybe you're going to see more purple individuals, but you're going to see less pure red and pure blue individuals. That's just a very simplistic way of examining it. But here we're going to talk about a little bit about different models of isolation in time. Say that you have animals, these purple dots, that live on this hourglass-shaped island. Animals from one end of the island are going to be able to breed with animals on the other side of the island because it's completely connected, it's one habitat, there's constant gene flow. If there's isolation where, say, the sea levels rise and the island gets divided into two round islands, there is no gene flow because this animal can't move across the sea. But without time, when these islands connect again, they haven't evolved enough differences to become different species, right? So this is ineffective. This is not an effective way of speciation happening. There's isolation, but there's no time. If there's just time, and there's constant gene flow, and it's been 10 million years, the habitat on the island is completely changed, and the species on the island has shifted to suit itself to this habitat a little bit more. Yeah, it's no longer the same species it was, but it's not becoming two or more species, right? It's still one thing. So it's only when you have both isolation over 10 million years of isolation, they become very different. And even then, when isolation is broken, when these two populations meet again, they're so different that they no longer recognize each other as the same species. So this is really a way of how speciation happens. This is a simplified way of doing it. In real life, things are more complicated. But this is a very helpful way of thinking about what we're going to discuss today, which is biogeography and patterns of finding different species and patterns of distributions of species. If you find species in different places that are kind of similar, it's probably because they were isolated for a long time, right? So what can isolation look like? I've said a lot about isolation. We've talked the example that I've covered is really an obvious case of geographic isolation. The populations just really cannot breed with each other because they're just not in the same place and they can't cross that one barrier that they have. But it can look like different things. I'm by and large a bird person, so most of my examples are going to be bird related. You have behavioral isolation, so if in birds, calls are really important in species recognition. So in the case of owls, for example, multiple owl species that can be reasonably closely related can live in the same place, but because they call differently, they don't recognize each other as potential mates. This could be an example of behavioral isolation. And then we're going to go quickly to the other side, temporal isolation. In some islands in the world, breeding seasons for bird species they do not coincide. And because of this, different populations only breed at different times, and there's no overlap, which means that each population is not sharing genes with each other. An example of this would be some of the Atlantic islands, where some of these storm petrels breed. And what you can see there is that actually you get multiple species breeding in the same sites in different times, right? And so that's an example of temporal isolation. But what I'm most interested in is really geographic isolation, and what we should all be most interested in, since we are located in the Philippines, is really geographic isolation. And this is where species become different, or they stop having gene flow because they're either in different places or in different habitats. And this case is really this is the Himalayan thrush, where one species, the Himalayan thrush proper, lives above the tree line in the Himalayas, so it's just this rocky habitat. And there's another species called the forest thrush, which lives in the forested habitat. Over time, they've evolved differences in terms of vocalizations and calls. They do sound different, but they look very similar. And the main difference in isolation is that one has adapted to these barren rocky slopes, and one has adapted to these lush forest patches that are just below that. And this isolation, even right next to each other, has been enough to result in speciation. And this brings out to the whole topic of this talk, which is biogeography. So what exactly is biogeography? It's really the patterns of flora and fauna and their distributions over space, right, and time. And a lot of this is really influenced by geomorphology. And what do I mean by this? It's really about the physical structures in place that can stop populations from meeting each other and breeding with each other. And understanding biogeography isn't just an academic exercise. A lot of people have this idea of biogeography where it's just like, okay, you know what, why are you doing more biogeography studies in the Philippines, right? Because we already know that the Philippines has so much endemism. We already know that it's very special. But that is not enough. It's not possible to put protected areas throughout the Philippine archipelago, right? We need to know where we should target these sites, and having a good understanding of biogeography and the patterns of distributions of different species go a long way in really helping us be a little bit more optimized in the allocation of protected areas. Resources are limited, conservation resources are even more limited, and optimizing these resources is really, really important. And that's something I want you to think about or have in mind throughout this presentation. So our understanding of biogeography initially was very coarse, right? We have these huge areas that we know have similar fauna, right? So we have North America, Central and South America, the cold parts of Asia, the warm parts of Asia, Australia, and Southern Europe and Africa. But over time, people get better understandings, right? So this is a more sophisticated understanding of biogeographic patterns. You can see that there are more areas being highlighted because we learn more about species and we learn to group them into finer and more detailed organizations. But biogeography is also a question of scale. We can look at global biogeographic patterns, but that's not the most useful in terms of conservation, and it's personally not the most interesting to me. Looking at finer scale patterns of endemism and finer scale patterns of biogeography I think is where it's at, right? So in Southeast Asia, we have 4 main biogeographic zones. We have the area that's north of the Malay Peninsula, so above the Isthmus of Kra, Indochina. We have the Sundayak Islands, which were surprise, surprise, actually all connected during the last ice age during the periods of low sea level. We have the Philippine archipelago, and we have this area called Wallacea, which is sort of this bridging series of islands between Asia and Australia. But more interestingly, even within the Philippines, right, we have these areas of biogeography, of similarity, of similar species being shared between certain island groups and completely different when you just cross from one island to the next. And so getting a better understanding of that is also part of, the study of biogeography. Biogeography, isolation by geography can look like many different things. You can have islands which are, very obvious. Most species, many bird species, for instance, won't cross across wide swathes of open water, right? So basically, just by having different land masses that are separated by big trenches of water like islands, you're already going to have isolation that way. Mountains can also be a barrier. Lowland species cannot get across high elevation habitats, right? It's just not suitable for them. And so in some places, some continental areas, huge mountain ranges like the Andes, areas east and west of them in South America, right, have completely different assemblages. You have sky islands. Sky islands are when you have these tiny little patches of mountains which act almost like islands because species in high elevation areas cannot live in low elevation areas. So each of these mountain ranges act as separate sky islands, so to speak, and can be places where species can go off on their own evolutionary trajectories. You can have habitat breaks, where there are these massive breaks in forests, for instance, are separated by unsuitable habitat like savanna, and rivers, which can be massive. So in the Philippines, the most important thing is, of course, islands, because this is an archipelago after all. But also we are learning about the importance of sky islands in the Philippines, and that's something that I will go into a bit later on. So before we can understand the patterns of diversity in the Philippines, we need to have a good understanding of where all of these animals came from in the first place. In most places, the animals that originate in that area come from somewhere else, right? Especially in small areas like islands, for example. Most animals originate in large continents and they slowly make their way to the islands. And getting a sense of where some of the forefathers of some of the Philippine animals come from is a good idea to give us a sense of which areas the Philippine archipelago had affinities with in the deep past. So before we start that, I spoke briefly about sea level drops during the Ice Age. What happens during an Ice Age? There's a lot of ice. Ice is made of water, and the water needs to come from somewhere. During the Ice Age, the extensive ice sheets basically took water out of the sea and left the sea a lot shallower than it is now. Up to 120 meters shallower, actually. So during the Ice Age, many areas that now are separated by sea were actually land. And the interesting thing that needs to be noted is that for the last 100,000 years, we've actually had more ice ages than warm spells. So the time that we're living in right now is actually atypical, right? We're living in an unusual period of Earth's recent history. So most of the time, ice sheets were there. Sea levels were much lower. And places that were disconnected in the past were actually connected. You could make an argument that you could actually walk from where I'm from, Singapore, all the way to parts of Indonesia that you would need to take a boat or a flight to nowadays. But while mainland Asia and many parts of Indonesia were connected by land during these ice ages, look at the Philippine archipelago. Some areas are connected by land. Islands of Panay, Negros, parts of Cebu were connected by land, but there's still a lot of space between them. Many of the seas in the Philippines are deep seas. This would not be surprising to anyone who comes from a marine background, for instance, but it is surprising for perhaps a layperson. This means that even during the ice ages, there was a lot of isolation that happened in the Philippine archipelago. Some islands were connected, yes, but many were disconnected. And this is what gives rise to patterns of lowland endemism in the Philippines. But first, let us talk a little bit about where some of these species came from. I think it's hanging. Okay. Oh, oops. Okay. It was lagging. Okay. So, shadlings. So, mainland Asia. The Asia I'm talking about here is Asia that is north of the Malay Peninsula, right? So areas that were typically more savanna and dry forest. One thing that surprises many people, but probably not you museum folk, because you guys actually run the museum, you have a good archaeological collection and a paleontological collection, is that there were elephants in the Philippines, there were rhinos in the Philippines, and these were all in the very recent past. So in many cases, some of these actually have affinities to mainland Asia. And the case of the rhino, the genus of rhino that is documented from the Philippines is Nessorhinus philippinensis. And its closest relative is actually from Taiwan, right? And so what this means is that there were links somehow that allowed animals to come in from not just the mainland of Southeast Asia, but also from places far to the north, like Taiwan. Perhaps areas like the Batanes were like during the low sea levels, were actually big enough masses of land that they could act as stepping stones between Taiwan and the northernmost parts of the Philippines. So this is all pretty interesting. And in addition, the Calamian deer, which is now restricted to just parts of Greater Palawan, also has its roots or its ancestors coming from mainland Southeast Asia. Then we have other parts of Asia like Malaysia, Borneo, which are very, very close to the Philippines. And you have species of birds that are shared. For example, these babblers. The entire row on top are birds from the Philippines. The row below are all birds that are possible to get in Borneo or Malaysia. So many of the babblers in the Philippines actually have sister species, very closely related species that are actually from neighboring Borneo. So that's another place where you can get a lot of your species coming from. Fish is something that people don't talk about as much, freshwater fish. This genus of catfish, the Pterocryptis, these are really interesting because there's one species, Tatayensis on the right, which is from Palawan, and there's one species in Borneo, but the rest of them are coming from Thailand, Indochina, so pretty far away. So what this shows is that there's an interesting link in the fish fauna between the Philippines, Palawan specifically, and Borneo, but also between both of them and Indochina, which is much further away than many of the other countries that you would expect. Besides mainland Southeast Asia and Borneo, you get places like Sulawesi, which is the big island that's just south of Mindanao. You get species of racquet-tail parrot, which have amazing diversity in the Philippines. You have about 5 or 6 species here. And you share them with the Sulawesi, as well as some of the islands that are associated with that, like Buru. And species of birds that live in the mountains, like turquoise flycatchers, that species is actually distributed from mountains in Luzon, all the way through Mindanao to Sulawesi, as well as some of the other islands like Buru and Seram there, in that area as well. And purple needletail, which is a huge swiftlet, up to this big. Looks like a blimp when it's flying around. It's restricted to the islands of the Philippines as well as to Sulawesi. And interestingly enough, there's an extinct species of pig that is unique to both the Philippines and Sulawesi, Syllabichorus. And this is a huge pig with huge tusks, and fossils have been found in Sulawesi, Mindanao, as well as parts of Luzon. So this had an extensive distribution between both of these islands. Fish as well, this genus of fish, very attractive, often sought after in the aquarium trade, Nomoramphus. These are found in Sulawesi and the Philippines. Unfortunately, both of these species are Sulawesi species. I couldn't find any images online or from people I know from the species in the Philippines. The freshwater fish fauna in the Philippines is poorly documented. There aren't really photos of live species often. Most of them are actually dead specimens. So anyone working on fish here, please go out and do more work. I'm very excited to hear more about it. And then more generally, to the Philippines, Borneo and Sulawesi, you have things like tarsiers, which I think everyone's very familiar with. And also, this is interesting to me, where you have homegrown endemic radiations. So these are species that don't have ancestors or close ancestors from almost anywhere else. They really are endemic genera that have spawned in the Philippines and diversified in-house in the Philippines. So this is really authentic homegrown Philippine endemism. And here you have pseudo gecko, you have the cloud rats, that are quite common in some of the mountains of Luzon, apple myna from Mindanao, as well as the Bagobo robin, which is a Mindanao mountain endemic. Okay, so now we go back into biogeography. Now we know where the species come from, but what about patterns of diversity in the Philippines itself, right? So the Philippines, of course, shares species with other areas. We've kind of covered that. But patterns of endemism in the Philippines are typically explained, or conventionally explained by this idea of the PAICs, the PAIC, Pleistocene Aggregate Island Complexes. I know this is a big series of words, but let me explain. During the Pleistocene was when the ice ages were around, right? During the ice ages, the sea levels dropped. Some islands in the Philippines were connected to each other. So you have places like Polillo, Catanduanes, Marinduque, and Luzon being part of this massive landmass called Greater Luzon. Negros, Panay, and Cebu were connected in the Greater Negros, in the Greater West Visayas, I guess. Greater Palawan includes Culion, Busuanga, Balabac, Samar, Leyte, Bohol, Mindanao, Basilan were all connected in Greater Mindanao, and much of the Sulu archipelago was also connected into a mega sort of like Greater Sulu. So these are sort of like, and Mindoro was always by itself. So these are sort of some of the major areas of endemism that you see in the Philippines nowadays. And all of them are sort of explained quite cleanly with the idea of the PAICs. Basically, every PAIC would be isolated from every other PAIC, and you would see endemic species on these different island groups, which actually is interesting because it explains a lot. It explains why Mindanao, Bohol, Samar, Leyte share some species, why Luzon, Catanduanes, Marinduque share species, as well as why Negros and Panay also have a shared endemism, element of endemism. So in some cases, it explains patterns really well. For example, the bleeding hearts, which are an endemic radiation of doves that is really just found in the Philippines. Each of the PAICs has its own species. You have the Luzon, you have Negros bleeding heart, which is on Negros and Panay. You have the Mindoro bleeding heart, and you have the Mindanao bleeding hearts and the Sulu bleeding hearts. So each of them occupies its own PAIC, right? And this makes sense from a biogeographic standpoint, right? Because all of these islands were joined in the past, and they all had gene flow, and they were never isolated for long enough, right? Because remember, these islands were connected more often than they were not connected in the recent past. Or not so recent past. So there has not been enough isolation between these islands really to give us different species. But between the PAICs itself, the isolation has been a long time coming, right? And so that's been plenty of time for each of these populations to go on their own evolutionary trajectories and evolve into different species. However, even though PAICs, explain big-scale endemism in the Philippines, they also explain some of the small-scale endemism. So I'm going to bring your attention to two of these red circles here. So the southernmost circle was Camiguin Sur. Camiguin Sur is a small island that's just north of Mindanao, very, very close to Mindanao, but has its own highly endemic fauna and flora. And the reason for this is that even though it's really small and very close to Mindanao, the seas between Camiguin Sur and Mindanao are deep. And so Camiguin Sur has never, ever been connected with Mindanao before. And this has given rise to it having its own element of endemism. It has endemic birds, for example, the Camiguin bulbul, the Camiguin bubuk, which is an owl, and even like mice, the Camiguin forest mouse. The other place is the RTS archipelago, and this is just Romblon, Tablas, and Sibuyan. I think the museum recently had an expedition to Sibuyan, and I'm sure there are going to be plenty of exciting things that result from this. In part because these islands were highly isolated from the other islands forever, right, for the longest time. So this means that they also have their own element of endemism. The Tabla strongo is found on one of these islands. The Platymantis lautoni is an endemic frog that's endemic to this archipelago. But there are also exceptions to the pikes, or exceptions or species that seem like they're exception to the pikes. For example, this one, the Bohol sunbird. So some people lump it together as part of the larger species group, the metallic winged sunbird, which can also occur in Luzon and Greater Mindanao. But the Bohol sunbird is the most different of the lot, right, genetically. And so on one hand, you'd be thinking, hey, Bohol was always connected to Samar Leyte and Mindanao. So what business does Bohol have having its own species or highly distinctive form, which is indicative of like isolation or a lack of gene flow? And I would bring you back to the map of the pikes, and I would show you that, hey, between Bohol, Samar and Leyte, you have a very, very, very narrow ridge of land, right? So yes, at the maximum extent of the sea level fall at 120 meters, this was land. But in areas in between, where it often would have been 100 meters, 80 meters lower than it was now, this area may not have actually been connected by land to the rest of the archipelago, right? To the rest of Greater Mindanao. And these periods of isolation were enough to give Bohol an element of endemism all its own. And if we look at Cebu, we get a similar pattern as well. There's endemic cinnamon plants to Cebu, the endemic birds, the black shama and the Cebu flower pecker, which is almost certainly extinct. Fingers crossed that it's not, and it's rediscovered eventually, but chances are slim. If you look at Cebu, the way that it was connected to the rest of Negros and Panay was really by a thin ridge. And during periods of sea level that were less than 120 meters below, there's a good chance that Cebu would have been isolated as well. And it's the same story for some of these areas. So like in Luzon, where we are, you have the big head of Luzon that's on the western side. And you have the tail of Bicol that stretches out towards the east. In some species, you actually get different forms on most of Luzon and in Bicol. For example, these blue flycatchers. There are different forms that exist in different areas, and part of this is really because the connection point between the two is really, really narrow. And having a really, really, really narrow connection point between these two areas can also be enough to reduce gene flow, right? May not eliminate it all immediately, but over time, if less individuals are traveling across this narrow trench of land, it means that there can be endemism that evolves. And you have the same story with the Zamboanga Peninsula in Mindanao, right? The Zamboanga bulbul is endemic to that area, and the connection between Zamboanga and the rest of Mindanao is really just dependent on that really, really thin strip of land. So we've really talked about how the pikes and the way that it's drawn and the way it's explained really does go to really explain to a large degree the patterns of endemism and biogeography that we see in the Philippines. Even areas that sort of seem like they're exceptions aren't really exceptions when you really look at the maps more closely. The last area in the Philippines that is particularly interesting is Palawan. Palawan is doing its own thing. A lot of its species have a greater affinity with things from Borneo as opposed to the rest of the Philippines. For example, the ventriloquial oriole and the common hill myna, these are both birds that you'd find commonly in Borneo, or at least in northern Borneo, but you do not find them at all in the rest of the Philippine archipelago. And the reason for this is that if you look at the map again, if you look at the pike map again, Borneo and Palawan were only ever disconnected by a really exceedingly thin stretch of water. And things that can cross that really thin stretch of water would have made it over to Palawan, right? So you see that in birds, you see that even in the hepatofauna. Like there are frogs, lungless frogs that occur in Palawan as well as Borneo, and there's a genus of turtles, Cybron rockalia, which only occurs in Palawan and the rest of Asia. So there is that connection, and this is, even in fishes you see that. So Hampala, which is a genus of like these big fish, which are called tsabrao in Southeast Asia, they are actually good eating. People catch them, fish them, and they eat them. They're highly expensive where I'm from. Palawan has one species, Hampala lopezi, which is unique compared to all other Hampala in that it has lines that cross the body longitudinally, right? As opposed to lines that come up that cross the body from up to down, like all of the other species do. So there are elements in multiple fronts, in birds, in mammals now, in mammals, in fish, and reptiles, that link Palawan to the rest of Asia. And this is also something that can be explained by the pikes. But I'm not just here to talk about pikes, right? There are some exceptions that can't really easily be explained by just land connection and ice age sea levels. For example, the Leyte plume warbler and the Mindanao plume warbler, these are species that don't live in the lowlands. The Leyte plume warbler is something that can be found at about 300 meters above sea level, but definitely not much below that. And these are things that the pikes have some difficulty explaining, because Samar Leyte were connected by thick stretches of land to Mindanao. So what exactly is going on? So one of the topics I briefly touched on was the idea of sky islands, right? So sky islands are basically mountain ranges which are isolated from each other. And because high elevation species can't move through the lowlands, what you get is isolation on each of these mountain ranges. And this is a pattern that is emerging in the Philippines, and it's pretty new for birds especially, and it's something that my work investigates. And basically trying to find out if sky islands are sort of like sub-centers of endemism within the pikes themselves. So one thing you need to know about the mountain ranges in the Philippines is that they're old. Some of them as old as the islands themselves. The Philippines has a complex geologic history, and some of the larger islands like Mindanao and Luzon are actually not formed as single islands. There were multiple islands that kind of slammed together across different suture zones. And where these islands slammed together, on these suture zones, you often find mountain ranges, right? Because when land slams together, like when India smashed into Asia, you got the Himalayas, right? So when you get the small islands that eventually form Mindanao and Luzon coming together, these forces also created mountain ranges. And what this tells us is that Luzon and Mindanao have been building mountains almost as soon as they existed in their present form. So these mountains are old. Some are as old as the Oligocene, about 34 million years old. And so this means that there is great potential for these mountains to harbor really old, isolated fauna that has been evolving on its own trajectory. These are sort of some of the greater, like the bigger mountain ranges in the Philippines. My work is trying to sample as many, of course, not all of them, because that would take a lot of effort, and try to get some understanding of how bird species are different on different mountain ranges. Or birds that we think are the same species on different mountain ranges may actually turn out to be, hey, they're actually different species, right? So sometimes these patterns of endemism amongst montane birds, they follow the pikes, right? So in the case of the turquoise flycatcher, which is a high mountain species that I've mentioned before, Luzon Mindoro, Negros Panay, and Greater Mindanao, they each have their own endemic subspecies, and they all look and they sound to an extent quite different. So that's in agreement with the pikes. In some cases though, like these forms of montane endemism defy the pikes. Panay and Negros were always connected by land during the Ice Age, but on their mountain ranges, in each of their mountain ranges, you get two different endemic species of striped babbler, the Negros striped babbler and the Panay striped babbler. And this is not in accordance with the pikes, because if you were going by the pike theory, you would assume that they would both be the same species. But because these mountain ranges have proven to be such great, like sky islands, and the lowlands between them have proven to be such an isolating mechanism, right, for gene flow, that you've actually evolved, these two populations have evolved in two different trajectories and ended up becoming different species. So this can also be illustrated in Mindanao, where different mountain ranges have different species of high elevation sunbird, Lina sunbird in the southeast mountain ranges, the Apo sunbird on the central mountain ranges and Mount Malindang, and the Tiboli sunbird, which is found on the southwestern mountain ranges. So that's all really interesting, and I'm talking a lot about stuff that's already been documented and cataloged before. But what remains unrecognized? We are looking at, so my work really looks at species that have sort of like slipped under the radar, so to speak. The bird here is the Bogobo robin, and this is actually a picture of one of the birds from southeast Mindanao, right? So those of you who are familiar with the bird, you know that for most of these areas that it occurs in, it has a really big white throat patch. But the birds from southeastern Mindanao have a very thin strip of white that can barely be seen in this photo. And they're much bigger, and they're also much darker than birds from elsewhere. So part of my work is really to uncover what remains unrecognized. So I want to find out about inter-island differences. Most mountain bird species are considered conspecific, or they occur across the whole archipelago from Luzon all the way to Mindanao. Inter-island mountains are more isolated than mountain ranges on the same island, so you'd expect to see more differences here. And there's a great chance for undocumented diversity. So of course, like if you look at the right side of the screen, you'd see the mountain leaf warbler. Leaf warblers are a group of birds that are famously stressful for ornithologists because different species look very similar. So when we heard that, there was a population of mountain leaf warbler in southeast Mindanao that looked remarkably different from birds elsewhere, with a white eye ring and also with extensive, and it also can have extensive white on the face, we were very excited. So these are examples of birds that we'd be keen to study. But beyond this, beyond studying birds on different islands, we're also interested in studying birds from different mountain ranges on the same island as well. So, in Mindanao is blessed with having multiple mountain ranges that are distinct and are not in contact with each other. This means that there's potential for each of the bird species on these different mountain ranges to really go off on their own evolutionary trajectory and become different species. And basically, we have to thank a lot of bird watchers for going to many of these mountain ranges and documenting some of these differences. In some birds that are small brown birds, like the long-tailed grasshopper warbler in the middle, you wouldn't be able to easily see differences in the plumage, but the calls are highly, highly, highly distinctive on these different ranges. So while my team and I, we haven't really actually been discoverers of any of these things, right? These are things that have been documented and noted by other people before us. We're hoping to sort of consolidate all of the evidence and bring in a genetic element to the taxonomy that we're doing and to sort of get some resolution on on how different these different birds are, basically. And so like more broadly, what are the conservation outcomes that we're hoping for from our research? We're hoping to elevate and describe new species as well as subspecies, but also highlight presently overlooked sites as key sites for preserving endemic species in the Philippines and deserving a more focused conservation attention. What does this mean? Basically, I said earlier, you can't protect the whole Philippines. The Philippines is a highly urbanized nation, it's highly populous. You're going to need to devote some areas to taking care of people. Those areas are not going to have forests, and those areas are not going to be the areas that you're going to prioritize for conservation and keeping species alive. Conservation resources are limited. We need to know where to allocate them. We need to know exactly where to specifically designate protected areas. By identifying these mountain ranges that are special and have a high element of endemism, especially amongst birds. Birds are some of the best predictors of endemism in other groups of animals, right? So if a bird can't get across a certain barrier, you can bet that mice, insects, fish, lizards are not going to be able to. Birds are much more mobile. So by identifying these new zones of endemism in each of these mountain ranges in the Philippines and understanding which mountain ranges have an element of endemism that is different from that of adjacent mountain ranges, this gives us a really good roadmap to sort of like tell you where is a good place to put protected areas, where do we prioritize conservation, where do we allocate these conservation resources. For instance, in southeastern Mindanao, there are no actually protected areas right now, right? Mount Tagubut, Mount Campalili, Mount Mayo, they are community managed areas, yes, and some areas are definitely of interest to authorities like the DNR, but none of them have been formally designated protected area, right, or strict protected areas. And so we're hoping that our research, when we show that some of these mountain ranges are special, have a lot of endemism, that will sort of give additional credence to some of the arguments made to designate these areas as protected, right? And that's really what we're hoping to do in terms of the big picture with our work. Biogeography of the Philippines as a whole is not that interesting because we already know that the Philippines is special. But what we are trying to set out to do is like which specific parts of the Philippines are extra special and to designate them as special areas that are worthy of protection and worthy of, you know, recognition and more research so that we can learn more about the archipelago but really protect the full suite of species that live here. So thank you so much for that, for your time, and thank you so much for listening and attending in the Zoom talk as well. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions later during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marvin, for that wonderful talk about Philippine biogeography. For our participants, please reserve your question, or perhaps you can write it in the chat box and then we'll read them later in the open forum. Okay, so for our second speaker, she is a research fellow and curator of birds at the Lee Kong Chan Natural History Museum, National Museum of Singapore. As an ornithologist at heart and evolutionary geneticist by practice, Yan Yi's research interests lie in studying the genetics of birds, as well as documenting Singapore's avifauna from a natural history perspective. So again, let's welcome Dr. Yan Yi Tan.
Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Yen Yi. Thank you for having me today. I'm very excited and very honored to be here today to be presenting to you about natural history collections in Singapore from a bird's eye perspective. I don't see my slides. Right, thank you. Right, so without further ado, let's begin. Just a little bit about myself. Yeah, so I began my journey as an ornithologist in NUS as an environmental studies student. And I furthered my studies at Imperial College in London, where I got exposed to more aspects of ornithology. And I've just finished my PhD at the National University of Singapore at the same research group as Movin. And now I am the research fellow and the curator of birds at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum of Singapore. I've only recently started this new position, so I'm very new to the museum scene, but I'm trying my best. Yeah, so my obsession with birds all started with this. When I was in the UK, I had the opportunity to do a lot of bird bringing or banding. What this involves is kind of like air fishing. So you would string mist nets across where birds would fly, and then you hope that they'll fly in. And when they do fly in, you get them out of the nets, you measure them, get biometrics, and then you band them with unique identification codes so that you, in the event when you recapture them, you can know a lot more about their life history, their longevity, and many other things. Yeah, so I was fortunate to have had a very, very amenable trainer to my who fueled my drive and motivation to learn more about these birds. So that's Colin. A shout out to Colin if you're watching. He's my trainer who trained me over a course of a year, and I managed to get a C permit with the British Trust of Ornithology, which allowed me to ring independently as a certified ringer. Yeah, so this is just a little collage of all the little birds who have graciously tolerated my handling over my time in the UK. Yeah. And there's nothing better than holding a bird in your hand to learn better about the birds that we love so much. Yeah, and this quickly spiraled into a full-blown obsession. I started going to different parts of the world to ring birds and learn more about the avifauna there. And this is a collage of me in various parts of the world, in Mongolia, in Portugal, with the grey heron over there. Yeah, grey herons are really dangerous, so you have to hold them like that, like a machine gun with the head in your hand, because otherwise they can peck your eyes out. Yeah, and some photos of me in Singapore, and also, of course, in Mindanao. Now I'm back home in Singapore. I have my roots firmly in Singapore, and now with the museum stuff, I have my research interests firmly planted in Singapore. I still continue to do what I love. I still study birds by going out into the field, catching them, and learning more about them. Yeah, so for this presentation, I'll be focusing a lot more about collections in Singapore. Yeah, so a brief history of the Li Hongqian Natural History Museum. It started way back in 1878. Actually, it may perhaps even earlier than that. The Raffles Museum is named after Sir Stamford Raffles. Most Singaporeans will know who he is. He is deemed as the founding father of British Singapore. Yes. So Raffles landed in Singapore on a ship on 1819, and he was the governor of Singapore for some time. And there's many institutions and buildings named after Raffles. So that was the humble beginnings of the museum, and it quickly became a renowned regional institution for the natural sciences. You can see that it was renamed the National Museum in 1971. So it was a long time as Raffles Museum, nearly 100 years. And right now it's in NUS in the modern ages. And we were officially open to just 9 years ago, and we just had our birthday 6 days ago. So happy birthday, Li Hongqian Natural History Museum. Yeah. And the collections themselves are called the Zoological Reference Collection, the ZRC for short. And it all began with Dr. Nicholas in 1877, who spearheaded the collections themselves. And then the collections grew, and they needed a permanent home. But a permanent home didn't come until very recently in 1988, 1987, 1988. So it changed locations many times, and during those times it survived the war, it survived transport and various unpleasant storage conditions. The cold storage of the collections only formally began when it was in the period where the National University of Singapore took custody of the collections in 1972. And even then it was kind of homeless. There wasn't a singular institution that held everything. It was scattered across the islands and shuttled across various departments, and now it lives permanently on the Cambridge campus. The photos here show the old collections, the home of the collections in the science faculty, but now we have our own building. Yeah, and there's about 566,000 lots of specimens in our museum. So a lot of them, and I'm concerned with that little fraction over there, about 34,000 specimens of a little over 1,000 species and counting, because museum work never stops, right? Yeah, so we definitely acknowledge the importance of natural history collections. The main ethos of being a natural history institution is to collect, maintain, and make available reference material for a global community of scholars for now, later, and hopefully forever. Yeah, so it serves as a timeless repository for many species, and especially for species that once existed and are now extinct. So in this collage of photos, these are specimens from the Burke Museum in Seattle, where I had the opportunity to visit just last December. This is the Eskimo curlew, which is probably already extinct in the wild. Again, fingers crossed, but slim chance. And there are also other very famous species that have gone extinct but still represented in museums, such as the passenger pigeon. So the passenger pigeon was once a very popular species that used to form flocks so big that they would block out the sun when they flew. And now it's gone extinct due to overhunting. So it's a common poster child for how extinction, no species is ever safe from extinction. And there's also the ivory-billed woodpecker, which is the holy grail for most birders in North America. Yeah. And then also in Singapore, we have species that were once breeding and living in Singapore, but are no longer in existence on our little island. Because they were extirpated due to human activities and various other reasons, such as habitat destruction. Yeah, so on the top row, you can see that that's the green broadbill, and the bottom row shows the red broadbill. The photos are courtesy of Movin, because we went to the collections and looked at them together. So these broadbills were once present and happily living on the island, but now, if they appear on the island, they're considered visitors and rare ones to that effect. Yeah, so besides serving as timeless repositories, museums also hold a vast resource for historic DNA. So with the advent of next generation sequencing technologies, it is now possible to harvest historic DNA from museum skins, which was not possible in the past because museum skins are, depending on storage conditions, can hold only highly degraded DNA, and that can be very challenging to extract and study. But nowadays, with better storage facilities and better awareness about how museum collections can be utilized for future research, there's an increasing awareness about about the importance of natural history collections, and it's slowly becoming a go-to resource for many scientists worldwide. So the paper that I highlight on the right is actually a publication by one of our dear colleagues at the Avian Evolution Lab. So Melody, if you're watching, this is for you. She did a really amazing study about the chickens in Singapore, and it showed that not just the chickens in Singapore, but chickens. She's a chickens lady, so she studied the Gallus complex. And through the use of comparing modern day samples with historic samples, she was able to elucidate the amount of introgression and how introgression affected how the chickens looked. So that was a really, really nice paper. I highly recommend it. Yeah, and besides genetics, there's also, of course, the comparing the morphologies between comparative morphology between the specimens in holdings. So if I'll allow you some time to study and look at this specimen over here of a blue crown hanging parrot and try to find what's unusual about this specimen. So this specimen was collected several years ago. The exact sampling date is unclear, but it was definitely within the past decade. Yeah, so the circle is not showing. There's a circle around the toes. So if you look at the toes carefully, there are 5 toes on each foot. Birds only have 4 toes, or usually only have 4 toes. So this is a very unusual specimen, which came to light when we were processing it just a few weeks ago before I came to the Philippines. And it was surprising for a few reasons. Firstly, because it had 5 toes. That's not usual. And secondly, because the arrangement of the toes is highly unprecedented. In parrots, such as the blue crown hanging parrot, the toes are arranged in a way called zygodactyl arrangement, which has 2 toes in front and 2 toes behind. But this individual had toes that were a bit like a human hand with the thumb pointing backwards. So this was a really interesting specimen that we hope to further study with maybe perhaps genomic data, and also comparing this specimen with the other blue crown hanging parrots that we have in Lee Kong Chian. Yeah, so there's a future project to come. Yeah, by any case, this shows that specimen collection is really important, because without this specimen, we would not have documentation of this phenomena, and there would not be any opportunity to study how this came about, whether or not it's a deleterious trait, is it harmful to the bird to have 5 toes, or is it actually helpful, and all these other sorts of things. Very exciting. Yeah, so it's also useful in studying birds that are widespread in inaccessible breeding locales. So in my PhD thesis, one of my chapters focused on studying the sand plovers in the Palearctic realm. So this complex comprises 3 sand plover species: the Siberian sand plovers in purple, the greater sand plovers who breed in Central Asia, and the Tibetan sand plovers who breed mainly in Tibet. So these sand plovers are highly similar, and they have only recently been clearly demarcated along their species limits due to whole genome data. But before that happened, the sand plovers used to be thought. We used to think that there were only 2 sand plover species: the greater sand plover and the lesser sand plover, because the Siberian sand plover and the Tibetan sand plovers are smaller bodied than the greater sand plover. So for many years, ornithologists were misled to believe that the Siberian and Tibetan sand plovers are actually the same species. But with genomic evidence now, we know that they're not. Yeah, and we are fortunate in the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum to have a very complete series of the sand plover complex, and I was able to photograph these specimens, breeding males in breeding plumage that show a very clear pattern in the forehead coloration. The greater sand plovers have 2 white spots on their forehead, whereas the Tibetan sand plovers do not have any white spots, if any at all. And the Siberian sand plovers, then the white spots return in the Siberian sand plovers. So it's a bit like a leapfrog pattern, and this may be due to the phenomena of character displacement. Without museum collections, we would not have been able to study this, and because what will have to happen is for you to go to Tibet, to go to all these high altitude areas that are hugely inaccessible, and also to go to Russia to study and sample all these populations. And we are able to conduct these morphological comparisons due to the efforts, the collecting efforts of many of our predecessors. Yeah, so in spite of the importance of natural history collections, they have been on a decline in the past few decades. So in pre-war period, like before the World War II, there was a lot of active collecting, especially in the area where I'm from, so Southeast Asia, the area around Singapore, because Singapore was a hub city, and many of the collectors came from Western countries, and they would use Singapore as a port to to transit or to go between their destinations. And as a result, the Li Kongqian has adopted many of these collections, and so a lot of our collections range from 1800s to 1940s. That's the bulk of the collections when it comes to birds. Yeah, and there's a study in North America that showed very clearly how the growth of collections has been on the decline. So while collections, once you collect a specimen, it's not going to go away, but we are concerned with keeping track of the time. So if you collect a specimen today, it can be useful in 50 years, but it doesn't mean that you should only collect in 50 years. It's important to have temporal representation. The reason being, with a good time series of natural history collections, you are able to do long-term time series studies that can track the effects of climate change and even the use of pesticides. In the top right-hand corner, the paper about eggshells, it was only possible because there existed a eggshell collection that showed how eggshells became thinner with the onset of use of DDT, which is a pesticide. Yeah. And also with natural history collections, you are able to track the effects of climate change on how animals respond to these worldwide trends. And also one thing to talk about is the ethical considerations of collecting higher vertebrates such as birds in recent times. So in the past, where people collectors were more indiscriminate in their practices, so they would go out and they would collect any and everything. But that, of course, is to the detriment of many species, which may be rarer. And nowadays, when we collect, we collect very, very in a very deliberate manner. We do not do, it's generally frowned upon to do indiscriminate collecting anymore. And it's a constraint, I wouldn't say it's a constraint, but it's the current understanding of how human activities can actually drive species to extinction, such as the passenger pigeon, right? If, say, everyone were to collect the passenger pigeon, then it would all go extinct all over again. Yeah, so one way to get around these to work around these ethical considerations is opportunistic collecting. And one of the methods that I champion back home in Singapore is carcass salvage. So what is carcass salvage? In Singapore, we have many buildings, much like Manila, but a lot more buildings because we are a small country, we're very dense. The buildings are structural obstacles for birds that fly through Singapore. Singapore lies on a migratory flyway, so birds do come through Singapore around the year, annually. And as birds fly through Singapore, sometimes they fly into buildings, and they are found by members of the public, and we collect them and process them and give them a permanent home in our museum. Yeah. So one of my collaborators that I'm working with, we actually are trying to build a network, an international network, to exchange these carcasses that are salvaged from Singapore with other museums in North America and also in in Europe. Yeah. Yeah, of course, salvaging bird carcasses is a multi-step process. So when we do active collecting, you go out, you catch the bird, and you bring it back to the museum or wherever you are going to process it. But when it comes to opportunistic collecting, you have to wait for them to show up. So I run a hotline, reporting hotline, where members of the public can report their findings to us, and we will triage and we will arrange for resources to collect them. So the first step is to collect the bird from whoever's holding it or wherever it is, and then process it, and then measure it, take all the measurements, take all the data you need. And we are a genetics lab. I was from a genetics lab, a research group. So we do a lot of tissue subsampling to get the DNA in ethanol for long-term storage. And yeah, it can be very thrilling because sometimes you don't even manage to collect the bird. So these are all photos from my collecting experiences. I went for an oriental pied hornbill that was discovered in the east side of Singapore. And then I brought it back to the lab and I measured it and I washed it. I'll tell you why not to wash a hornbill later. Yeah, and I'm largely self-taught. Before I was in contact with other museums and institutions, and before I was curator, this was largely a passion project. So I would go online and I'll look at videos on YouTube or I'll Google how to make spread wings or how to clean a bird skull. And then through trial and error, I got better, and I was able to prepare some really nice and cool-looking specimens. So I'm able to, there's many ways to prepare a specimen. It all depends on the coherence with the collections, the needs of the collections, and also what purpose the specimen is going to serve. So as a common practice, we usually take a spread wing and the skin of the bird. But in special cases, we can do things like just the tail or the skull and things like that. And all these preparation methods are pretty interesting to learn. Yeah, and of course, like I said, it was a DIY project. I used to, before I had access to facilities, I used to dry the bird skins on my balcony and hope that my neighbors wouldn't report me. And shout out to my domestic partner who tolerated all my antics with all these skulls and bird wings lying around the house. And I would study how the skulls would fit together and glue them back together, and that took a long time. It's like a morbid puzzle. But all the effort is well worth it. One of my collection trips turned out to be the first specimen of the Eurasian sparrowhawk in Singapore. The Eurasian sparrowhawk is a vagrant to Singapore, and the one that we found that day was only Singapore's 6th record. So it's amazing how it even ended up there, was reported, and I got there just in time before the cleaners were going to throw it away. It's kind of harrowing. But we got something out of it, and the bird will now live on forever. Yeah, so besides doing the collecting of the specimens themselves, I also do long-term monitoring of the urban mortality of birds in Singapore. So I maintain a database. Whenever people report their findings of a dead bird, I always log it onto our database. Whether or not we collect it is immaterial. We collect the data anyway, and I'm proud to say that our data set is now over 900 entries over 4 years. That's pretty dense. And so for people watching in Singapore, please contact the hotline if you ever see a dead bird, because I will be very happy to respond to you. I respond as fast as I can, and me and my team will answer your report as soon as possible. Yeah, so the photos on the right is a quick collage of just the birds that were reported within the past 2 weeks. So we get pretty frequent reports. That's a white-breasted water hen, and the very dark one is a house crow, and the one on the bottom left is a northern bubuk, red-legged crake, and a spotted dove. So all these were reported, and some of them were collected. Yeah, of course there are challenges and caveats to running such a salvage project and opportunistic collecting efforts. Many incidents go unreported, and that's given because it's opportunistic, right? You can't find birds where people don't go. So And also, many times people may not know about our hotline, and they may struggle to report, to find the correct avenue to help the bird. So these are both posts from Facebook, and that's a crested goshawk and an oriental honey buzzard. So these two birds, I reached out to them through Facebook. I said, hi, thanks for reporting. May I know where the bird is? Was it picked up? Where did it go? Did it go to a wildlife rehabilitation center? Something like that. They never replied me, but that's fine because people don't owe you anything, and it's okay. People don't have to reply you, but we always try. We always try our best to collect the information if possible. But one of the caveats, of course, with an opportunistic collecting effort is that you will get a lot of underreporting. And there's also a lot of bias towards colorful, charismatic, and larger birds. So on the left, the panel on the left, and the multi-panel on the left are all very colorful birds that are very often reported to our hotline. The blue-winged pitta is by far the leader of reporting. So every year we get easily 30, 40 birds being reported. That's like an average of one a day, one every, my math is failing me. One every 6 days. But in the peak migratory seasons of the blue-winged pitta in April and in October, I can get up to 3 a day. And people often tell us, oh no, what is this bird? It's so colorful. We really want to, does the museum want it? It's really pretty. We want it to go to science. And unfortunately, things that are drab and not so colorful don't get this kind of treatment. They don't evoke such an emotional response. And that's a very natural human thing. So what I do to try to circumvent this caveat is to do more promotion, more publicity about our hotline, and to inform people that every bird is valuable. Every carcass that you come across is valuable. Please report it to us. Whether or not we collect it doesn't matter because your report itself is already very important. Yeah, and of course, I derive a bit of enjoyment from, it's a bit thrilling to, get a report that, oh, this bird is here, quick, come and get it, and you go and you hope that it's there. Can be said to be somewhat a morbid treasure hunt. So these are 3 instances that I remember very clearly that are ingrained in my mind very much. So the collared scops owl on the left was probably hit by a car. And I got a call at 9 p.m. on the first day of Lunar New Year. I was I'm Chinese, so I have reunion dinner or like the New Year dinner with my family, and I was just there having dinner, and then I got the call on the hotline. Hey, there's a scops owl, and I was like, okay, I have to go. Sorry, everyone. and we got it, but not without a lot of effort because it was raining. It was raining, and the bird was wet. So I had to bring it home and hide in my room and dry it because moisture is really bad for carcass preservation. Yeah, but in any case, we got it. And then there was a northern boobook that was reported just earlier this year, and I went down within half an hour and the bird was gone. And the person was very apologetic. The person who reported it was very apologetic. She said, oh, I'm so sorry, I wish we had collected it, we could have secured it for you. But that's not always possible. It's not... I would say that it's not polite to tell people to necessarily keep a dead bird in their car, in their handbag, or in their freezer for you. So I was really very grateful to get a report, and we were thinking, could someone have picked it up and thrown it away? Because it's a pretty big bird. A northern boobook is about this big, about 40 cm. I can't remember. So it's a big bird, it's very visible. And I thought, maybe someone threw it away. So we went dumpster diving, went to the nearest dustbin and looked in it. And there it was in a bag, nicely bagged, pristine and wonderful. So I took it out and took a photo to commemorate this incident. And actually, that's not the first time I've dumpster dived this. It's a common occurrence. People are well-meaning, and usually people are really nice to... in Singapore, I think there's a general consensus of coexisting with nature and animals. So when people find a dead animal, they usually feel bad, and they would try to do their best for the animal. So sometimes that involves, like throwing it away for hygiene reasons, or maybe putting it into grass for nature to have it back. Yeah, and the Asian open bills were an unusual encounter in 2020. During those months, Singaporean birders would remember that there was an eruption of Asian open bills in Singapore. There were hundreds of birds circling around. And in March, a few months after that eruption, someone dialed our hotline and said, hey, there's an open bill right here, and they sent the coordinates. And of course, we went down to look for it. And it was right there where the coordinates were. And we were on our way back to the lab to process it. And I remember that my colleague Laura and I didn't have a big enough plastic bag because we didn't know how big an open bill was. So we had a small plastic bag. And we had to get a bigger one. So we went to a nearby gas station to buy something so that we can get a big enough plastic bag. So we got that. We were on our way back. And then we saw another open bill under a bush. And we're like, oh no, we have to collect it, right? Okay, now we need another plastic bag. So we went back to the gas station and we bought another ice cream and we brought it back to the lab. Yeah, so there was some interesting incidents. And it's often a race against time. So whenever a bird is found, you are racing against heat, humidity, and people to get to the specimen. So these are 3 examples where I remember I had to rush because I knew that they were going to go away. So the grey rump tree swift was actually reported, but a bit too late because the person reported it to our hotline after he or she had already thrown it away. Yeah, but it was a cool record to have. And this Siberian thrush was actually left in the bush because the person who found it thought it was too pretty a bird to throw into the bin. So he left it in the bush. And then by the time I got there, there was only a few feathers left. So it meant that a cat had taken it. Yeah. And then of course the Eurasian sparrowhawk I also had to run for it because that building where it was found is kind of like an office building. So in Singapore, many office buildings have very fastidious cleaning crews because they have to keep up the appearances of the central business district. It has to be clean, it has to be pristine. So what happens is that many times when birds are found, they're just discarded because they don't have time. They just simply do not have the time and resources to deal with it. So when I reached there, I remember running for it. There was a cleaner auntie or uncle who was there just casually pushing the trolley. And then he saw me pick up the bird. He was like, oh, why do you pick up the bird? I was going to throw it away. I said, oh, no, we're from NUS. We had to collect it. This is an important bird. Yeah, so if I were there, maybe 5 minutes later, the bird would have been gone. So yeah, it's always exciting. Yeah, and of course, with this reporting hotline, we also get valuable records of species that would otherwise be very difficult to detect, especially species that are nocturnal migrants, such as the northern bobuk, and also many of the crake species, which are elusive, skulky, and famously difficult to see as a bird watcher. So whenever we get these records, I will always upload it onto our Singapore Birds database, which is is a publicly accessible database where we keep all these records. And I highly recommend that you use it as reference material if you're ever in Singapore bird watching. This is the go-to resource. Yeah, and besides running around the island and collecting things, I also do a lot of international collaboration and network because as a natural history institution, we shouldn't restrict our scope to just our little island. We should try to work with other countries, neighboring countries and beyond to foster more collaborative activities and to exchange material because you never want to put all your eggs into one basket. What if say one day something would happen to collections aid and at least you have an insurance collection somewhere else, and that's particularly important, especially if we have so much surplus. Like we have so many blue wing pittas. Do you guys want some blue wing pittas? We have so many of them. So it's always a wonderful. It always makes me smile whenever I present these pittas, these colorful birds, to collaborators, and they are so so happy to receive them, and at least they will not be kept frozen in the freezer forever. They would be processed and they will be useful to scientists worldwide. So about 2-3 years ago, I sent a shipment of 70 specimens to NHM UK, and they were very happy. We managed to send them a white-bellied sea eagle, which looked very much like a a baby when it was wrapped up because a white-bellied seagull is about this big. Yeah, but birds are light, so that was about 2 kilos. Yeah, not very heavy. Yeah, and besides that, I also work closely with American Museums, the Burke, and Cornell. We had a collaboration just last year where we sent and exchange people and material across our countries. So I had the fortune of visiting them, and they had the fortune of visiting us, and we exchanged expertise, and also I got to see how museums organized their collections, and I drew some inspiration, which I am putting into practice as curator now. So on the bottom right-hand corner, you will see all the specimens that I made as a very, very beginner. So one of the specimens there is my very first specimen, and it has no tail because I cut the tail off. So it's okay to make mistakes, but people, as long as you try. And those are my two collaborators, Mary Margaret and Erin, who came over to Singapore, and they prepared a variety of specimens, and we had a really good time together. So I'm hoping to continue these collaborations. And also just recently, about 4 weeks ago, we had Yale University come and do the same thing. They came and we exchanged ideas and collaborated, and I brought them to climb our highest point in Singapore, which is Bukit Timah Hill. It's a hill, it's not a mountain. It's only 163 meters high. But they had a good time, and we saw some really nice birds. Yeah, and of course, besides all these collaborations, I also do go on expeditions. Most recently with Movin, because Movin has a lot of expeditions planned for the Philippines. And he said, hey, Yeni, why don't you come along? I said, okay, yeah, sure, why not? So just last year, in January, February, we were in Mindanao, and these are the places that we visited. And that's the mountain leaf warbler. Was it mountain leaf warbler? The Nigrorum, Phyloscopus nigrorum. Very yellow lemon-flavored bird. Yeah, and Lake Holong was beautiful, and we also managed to go into southwest Mindanao, which was also a very nice place to go to. One of the best lowland forests we saw in Mindanao. And part 2 is right now, so we just finished part 2. And Movin has spoken a bit about what we do and what we will be doing in the future with all the specimens and material we've collected. And with Movin, I work with Movin to document the possibly new mountain endemics. So when we have new taxa that are undescribed, it's important and imperative that you have a specimen to ascribe the new name to. So without a specimen, without collecting, you can't have newly described taxa, and this is why it's pretty important. And I was kind of thrown to the wolves when it came to this, because last year when we first came here, I was not really ready to collect and prepare birds. I was only maybe 5 birds after my tailless starling. So it was kind of harrowing, because Movin told me, Yeni, this is important. And I'm like, okay, I'll try my best. So I only had a first aid kit, and I did my best. In the hotel room, I tried to dry it with the air conditioning. And well, they look like birds, so I think it's fine. I try my best. And yeah, we'll get better. But in any case, it's been a real journey and a real honor to be here. And of course, in the Philippines, we've met and worked with so many people from various universities, and of course, the National Museum today, and also hopefully in the future. Yeah, these are just photos and snippets of the times we had. So I know that some of you are watching, so thank you for having us. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll be happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Tan Yen Yi. Please sit po in the front for the open forum session. And now we are moving on to the open forum session. So if you have any questions to our speakers, you may do so by raising the hand button, and you can unmute yourself and open your cam, or you can enter the questions in the chat box, and we will read them later one by one. So anyone? Well, I guess we're just really overwhelmed with that lot of information. It's a chat box. for a while. Okay, the first question is from our audience in Zoom. Is it possible to maintain bird biodiversity by proposing native species of flora in urban projects and proposed designs? Second, from your point of view, what are the things or considerations that you can suggest for us landscape architects that we can do to help and maintain the fauna in our field, especially in urban projects?
Okay, thanks for that question. I love hearing these types of questions because they speak towards interdisciplinary, aspects of the work that we do. So whenever I get questions like this, I always say it's really, really interesting for us to come from Singapore because Singapore, I mean, the way it's marketed is really like a garden city, and now they're trying to do this thing where they say it's a city in a forest almost. So in many places in Singapore, we do integrate a lot of vegetation into our urban matrix. So there's a lot of greening that happens way, way, way deeper into the urban spaces than you would expect. Definitely more in other contemporary like Southeast Asian cities. So I always say that Singapore is a really interesting case study to think about what is possible in terms of getting bird life into these urban spaces. So definitely yes, incorporating urban native species into sort of these planting palettes that you have for the urban areas is imperative. But I think beyond that, it's also knowing about what exactly you want to come out of it. So there's two things. Number one, you want to get species that you know are food for birds, right? For instance, if you want to attract bird. So you can have flowers that are attractive to sunbirds. You can have fruits that's attractive to some of your urban adapted pigeons and other species that are similar. The other thing that you might want to think about is about levels. So when you look at a forest, especially a tropical forest, they occur in very specific strata. You have your understory, or rather you have your ground floor, you have your understory, you have your canopy, and you have your emergent layer. So these are all like very clearly demarcated levels in a forest. When you're thinking about a planting palette for urban sites, sort of picking species that would grow to different heights and would fit these different strata would really be important. So this is something that's being pioneered in Singapore right now, where a lot of native species are being selected, not just on the basis that they're native, but because they occupy different levels of the forest, and so mimic this sort of tiered planting that over time resembles sort of a native forest would be really, really useful in sort of like, not just, like helping with conservation and also like just the practical effects of like, your city gets less hot because it's green, right? There's less of a urban heat island effect. But also in terms of mimicking key aspects of a forest environment and sort of like luring some species out, right? So in Singapore, we've actually managed to get some forest-dependent canopy species well into the urban matrix. So things like the common hill myna that I talked about earlier, we get them really near my house, which is like in the middle of the city, right? Because we've planted so much green into these urban areas itself. And that means that there's habitat for these species to use. Yep.
I have something to add to that. So from a collections point of view, our favorite place to collect birds is buildings. So as landscape architects, you may want to be aware that if you have a building, there's a risk for collision. It doesn't matter what a building is made of, there will always be a risk. But what you can do is to mitigate that risk. Glass and reflective surfaces are especially bad for birds that migrate at night because they can't see at night very well or as well. So they tend to fly into these structures, and because of how fast they fly at night, birds migrate at night to avoid diurnal predators. So they tend to fly really fast. And oftentimes the birds that I collect, the blue-winged pitas, they are found in the morning when people go to work. So I would say minimize the use of reflective surfaces, and if you do need to use glass or anything that's transparent, you can always make the glass more visible to birds by drawing your curtains or putting some bird-friendly stickers. There are decals that you can put on glass that can help to mitigate the risk of birds flying into the window. And also, what was that I was thinking about? So there's also one more thing. So if you do a lot of greenery around a building, you also attract the birds near the building, and we often see a lot of human-animal conflict in these transition areas. So if we want to green our island, we also need to be very cognizant of the fact that there may be more urban collisions, be it birds flying into structures, or even traffic accidents like roadkill incidents will also increase. So whenever we are doing development plans and things like that, these are things to be aware about, that if you're closer or you're trying to get nature closer to you, it may actually be to the detriment of the animals that we love. So not to say that development is wrong, but it's just something to keep in mind and to be aware of. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Tan and Mr. Movin. Our second question is from Ms. Merlene Jeromiano. She said that this is addressed to Dr. Tan Yan Yi. It's interesting to know the efforts of your museum, and you in particular, in monitoring the extensive avian fauna and of the natural history collections of Singapore. Her question is, how does your museum maintain these collections, and what are some of the preventive conservation measures, perhaps? I guess it's preventive measures, and how do you maintain the specimens?
All right. So in our museum, we hold our scientific collections in a specific humidity-controlled and air-conditioned environment. So I think the humidity is about 60%, if not a bit lower, because Singapore's humidity is about 90%, if not 100 sometimes, and it's terrible. It's terrible, absolutely terrible for preservation of specimens. So we do need a controlled environment to hold these specimens for long term. And air conditioning is uncomfortably cold in there, so that's good. So in general, we want to store the specimens as cold as possible and not too dry, because if it's too dry, too much moisture, too dry, specimens that are too dry can crack and become more fragile. So about 40 to 60% is a good estimate, as far as I know. Yeah, and also of course, when you are preparing the specimen, it's very important to just prepare it the best you can, because there's ways to do things which are hard for me to explain without showing you. So that the bird doesn't lose too many feathers, or the skin doesn't get torn, or the appropriate soft tissues are removed, because soft tissues can cause and accelerate the decomposition of a specimen, especially fat. Fat is really bad for skins. It causes them to go yellow, it causes them to go rancid. So there are many considerations, but it's always a work in progress. So as we go and we practice natural history, collecting and maintaining our collections, we learn new things, and we just adapt as we go.
Thank you. Our next question is again to Ms. Yan Yi. This is from Aaron James Ortega. His question is, what are the precautions you practice when it comes to processing cadavers, since there are possibilities of disease vectors?
Cadavers are for humans, so we don't use the word cadavers, we say carcasses. When I handle carcasses, as a general rule of thumb, you wear gloves. But as many specimen preparators know, gloves are really, they interfere with the preparation process, because you need to feel the layers of skin with the muscle, and that's not something, the tactile sensitivity is something that you need when you prepare a specimen. So what I do is that I usually don't prepare with gloves. I prepare without gloves, and you treat the bird as you would raw chicken. So every time you touch the bird and you want to go somewhere else or eat something, you wash your hands. Yeah, just a general rule of thumb. With regards to zoonotic diseases, where I'm from in Singapore, we don't really have an incidence of the highly pathogenic avian influenza. So the concern would be actually not zoonotic. That means animal to human. That's not a big concern, but more of if you have your pet birds, then you will have to be more aware about handling, the birds in the museum, and then going home and then playing with your parakeet or something, which I have. So I have pet birds at home, and I do take precautions before I go home. I wash my hands. I make sure I don't, accidentally poison or pass diseases onto my beloved pets at home. Yeah. So yeah, in Singapore we don't really have the highly pathogenic avian influenza. There has been long-term surveillance by the animal veterinary service in Singapore. So they haven't found any incidences of HPAI so far. But HPAI is a big concern in Europe because I don't know, it's just there. And because of how the flyways work, the Afro-Atlantic flyway, the entire flyway that longitude from Europe down to Africa is where HPAI is a real concern. So as far as we are concerned here, we don't really have that worry.
Thank you. Our next question is from Kenneth Sanchez. This is directed to Mr. Movin. He said, based on your research here in the Philippines, is there any evidence to suggest that microhabitat variation, like for example, available food, vegetation type, within a biogeographic region can have a stronger influence on bird speciation compared to restricted gene flow between those regions?
That's a really good question. Okay, so I think there's an overarching principle that we kind of need to get here, which is that the evolutionary trajectories of different populations is going to be two things, right? On one hand, it's going to be the differences, the genetic differences that these populations had before. Both these populations might have some small differences that become bigger and bigger differences over time, over multiple generations. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, like as you said, the environment itself. The environment itself may be subtly different in different mountain ranges. And we do see that in many places. In some places, some birds that you'd only get at like elevations above 2,500 meters come down to 1,008 or 1,700 meters. And these might be because of minute differences in the habitat types in these different mountain ranges. So, and each of these habitats, because they're subtly different, would select for different traits in each of the populations of the birds. So whenever I say evolutionary trajectories, it doesn't necessarily just mean like the differences that already existed in these birds would just continue becoming more different in these different populations over time, but also selection. Selection is really about how the environment chooses, or not really chooses, like selects for different traits in a group, right? So perhaps in one mountain, the insects tend to be larger, right? Harder to process. The bird population there may evolve more powerful bills to process that insects, whereas the bird population in another mountain range where the insects are slightly smaller, easier to process, can just get by with smaller bills. Bigger bills mean you need to invest more resources, right, and more energy into building these structures, these bill structures. And so it only becomes selected for in an environment where it is an advantage. And so these are twin factors that actually do result in things becoming different, right? So yes, it's true. Selection is also important, and it's not something that I highlighted as much in the presentation earlier, but it is also, yeah. But short answer is that yes, both factors are equally important in resulting in speciation, right?
I guess this is connected with the last question. He said, this from Levi Necesito, can isolated mountain regions isolate population and create possible divergence with food preference, behavior, and cause since gene flow is restricted?
Oh yes, definitely. So same answer to the same question to the question earlier, which is that selection in terms of different food resources or different microhabitats, not microhabitats, but different habitats like different temperatures, different rainfall regimes, can all change the way that populations react to them or eventually adapt to them, and that can result in speciation as well.
Okay. Again, this is from Kenneth Sanchez. He said, are there any tips or advice for research groups who may want to start their own biodiversity collection? This is for Dr. Yen Yi. Are there any tips or advice for research group to start their own collection? Who may want to start their own biodiversity collection?
Right, so that's a very, very good concern to have, because it means that you have the heart to begin it, and I think that's the main obstacle for most people, because I think most scientists don't realize how much time it takes to process a specimen. And even as a junior scientist, when I was doing my PhD, I kind of took it for granted that specimens will always be there. Like, okay, we need this specimen. We'll just go to this museum and find it, or just email them and ask them if they have it. it was not until, it was only when I started to do my own preparation then I realized, wow, this is a lot of work. I have to go and take a bus and a whatever to go to to get the bird and then bring it back and then do all these things and then dry it, make sure that it's drying in place and all these things. So when it comes to starting your own collection, I would say just go for it. You will need to think about the processing material. So as a very bare bone kit would just have a penknife. It's possible to prepare a bird with a penknife with enough practice. And then you need somewhere to store the specimen. So even a dry cabinet works. You know, those the dry cabinets that people use, photographers use for electronics or their cameras, that's actually good enough. And just wherever it's the correct humidity and as cold as possible. So it can be just the coldest part of your house or the coldest part of the room or the building. And as long as you have it insect-proof. So yeah, beetles are really bad. And also mold can be a big problem if your humidity is not kept correctly. So humidity, temperature, and insects, those are your three concerns when it comes to storage. But when it comes to preparation, I would say that it's very daunting if you begin when you're beginning, because you cut the bird and you're like, oh my God, what's this? Like, what's this part of the bird? I have never seen it before. Everything is going to be new. It's going to be challenging, but just don't be afraid to make mistakes. So practice on the non-valuable specimens first, like maybe non-types, and also, you know, like we get a lot of Asian glossy starlings in Singapore because of they love to fly very fast and they love to fly into windows for some reason, and they like to fly together. So oftentimes when I get a call for Asian glossy starlings, it's usually like 3 or 4 individuals. And starlings are great to start with, so because the skin is tough and the feathers don't fall out easily. So I always, when I'm teaching students or teaching someone to prepare specimens, I always go for a starling because they are the easiest and you know, sometimes you just need some confidence to begin. And I would strongly encourage that you try and fail, and that's fine because I've also failed. I've cut off the tail of a starling. So yeah, but that's how you learn, and just start and do your best. There's plenty of resources online to help also with specimen preparation. There's PDFs, there's also videos of professional taxidermists who can teach you how to skin a bird properly. Yeah, and it's a fun world to be in.
Thank you, Dr. Chan. This question is for Sir Movin. This from Aaron James. You mentioned that sky islands are relatively understudied sites for speciation. What are the factors that you're looking for in considering a possible site as a possible sky island other than elevation? Are you also looking for other non-avian indicator species?
Excellent question. Okay, so there are a few things. I say that sky islands are sort of in their infancy in terms of being studied in the Philippines, and it's true. In some taxa, they are slightly better studied than others. For example, Larry Heaney, for example, has done a lot of work on small rodents across the archipelago with really dense sampling in Luzon, for instance. So he's identified pretty much a whole set of centers of endemism for rodents in Luzon. Having said that, what you want to look at besides elevation is how isolated the mountain range is from other ranges that are nearby, right? Because one of the key tenets of speciation or having or leading to centers of endemism is really about isolation. So how isolated is your peak from all the peaks surrounding it? For example, in Mindanao, the 5 mountain ranges are really quite far apart, right? Like they're separated by lowland areas by sometimes hundreds of kilometers. The other thing that you want to do is really think about what is the species that you are studying, what taxon are you working on? If you're working on insects, for instance, every mountain is going to have endemics. Every mountain that's right next to each other, they're going to have something different. And that's all because of how good something is at dispersing across area, right? So for birds, we have a bit of the easiest work because birds are dispersive. Amongst all taxa groups, birds are probably best at getting around. So because of that, I can look at more broad patterns. Looking at isolated mountains, like 1 or 2 mountains, that are just isolated by not that much distance in, say, for example, Luzon. For example, Mount Banahao is not going to have many endemic species or forms of birds, right? They're probably going to be similar to their contemporaries in other mountain ranges. Number one, because it's an isolated peak, there's not enough area for endemism to evolve in the long term. Number two, they're not that isolated compared to some of the mountain ranges elsewhere. But if you're studying something like rodents, which are much, much worse at getting around and dispersing than birds, for instance, and than most birds, for instance, then Mount Banahao and Mount Cristobal, for example, can become viable areas of study. Or things like freshwater crabs that are endemic to high elevation areas. That one almost because those are not just restricted to high elevations. They're going to be restricted to high elevation wet areas that are adjacent to streams, right? So it's a very specific microhabitat. So in those cases, almost every mountain range is going to have something special. And that's something that I guess has been noticed before. But a lot of taxa, depending on what you study, the level of isolation is what changes, right? If you're studying something small that's not very dispersive, individual peaks like the Zambales, or like smaller mountain ranges like the Zambales, or like individual peaks like Mount Banahao can have endemism. But if your taxon is more dispersive like birds, then you look at larger mountain ranges that are very isolated from each other. Yep.
Thank you, sir. This is for Miss Doc Yan Lee. This is from Ms. Jasmine Marin. She said, how do you prepare collection permits for these opportunistic collections, meaning the bird strike carcasses? She said that acquiring collection permits in the Philippines could take a long way, and by law, any wild organism or its derivatives may not be taken without permits. Opportunistic collections such as window strike carcasses are equally important. So how is the collection permit treated in your museum for these specimens?
Right. So before I started with the museum, I was with the research group, the Avian Evolution Lab in NUS, and that's when we've already been doing these opportunistic collections for quite some time. So in Singapore, you don't need a collecting permit per se for opportunistic collecting because I'm pretty sure I read the law before, and it says that as long as it's ethically sourced, you are allowed to take the animal. So there are several taxidermy practices in Singapore who go by this rule. So they also do opportunistic collecting, and they do taxidermy. That means the lifelike mounting of the specimens, and they are for commercial purposes. So for us as a museum, as a scientific institution, we collect, of course, for research. And as the Natural History Museum of Singapore, and the only one, we have kind of an implicit arrangement to that whatever we collect is for science. And as we also have like the appropriate biosafety certifications for the labs and things like that to process and properly handle these materials. So, and even if you get a permit from the governing authority, the NPARKS, which is like the DNR counterpart in Singapore, there's a clause that stipulates that every specimen that collects must be reposited in the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. So at the end of the day, it's a bit like a shortcut, but also it's an implicit understanding, I would say. We don't necessarily have to have collecting permits for these kind of opportunistic carcasses, as long as we don't go and do active collecting, because that's strongly prohibited in Singapore due to how small we are, and how we have a very strong stance against poaching. So enforcement is very tight, and there are cameras everywhere. So there's no way, even as a natural history museum, you can get away with active collecting. So yeah, non-licensed active collecting. So I hope that answers your question. I understand that in the Philippines you have very good laws, actually, very, very strict permitting laws when it comes to the usage of natural history, of natural resources. So I think that's the so-called trouble that you go through to get the permits is for a better cause.
This next question is really in relation to the bird strike carcasses. This is from Levi Necesito. Were there any instances that you process bird strike carcasses that has parasitic organisms that were present in the removal of fats, organs, and muscle tissues?
Of course. there's like a lot of nasty things you can see in when you process a carcass. So sometimes the first key to a sick bird, a bird that's sick or has a lot of parasites, is that it's very skinny. So usually not internal parasites. I've not seen a lot of internal parasites, and if I've seen them, I wouldn't know what they were because I'm not a parasitologist. So, but I did see like little worms in, like little white worms in the cavity, the abdominal cavity of birds when I cut them, when I cut it open to check for the gonads, the sexual organs to sex the bird. But I've seen a lot of ectoparasites, so things like lice, ticks, very rarely, but they are present. And these things are of scientific interest, in fact, because these ectoparasites are hitchhikers. So they take a ride on, you know, all these flying dragon beings, and they end up in different parts of the world. And we do have people who are interested, collaborators and also in-house researchers who are interested in these ectoparasites. The Eurasian sparrowhawk that I was talking about in my presentation had a lot of lice on its face, and I suspect that that's one of the reasons why it was in Singapore. It's probably disoriented, tired from being so far away from where it's supposed to be. Eurasian sparrowhawks are not supposed to be in Singapore. So that's probably a contributory factor to its demise eventually. Yeah, so yeah, you learn a lot from doing your own specimen preparation, and also just being in touch with the birds themselves.
Thank you, po. I guess you can both answer this next question. Considering your valuable experience in studying and researching avian species, I would be keen to learn about your insights on the importance of diverse bird ecosystem within urban areas. How do you believe this bird ecosystem contribute to the broader ecosystem in a meaningful way?
Thanks for that question. Okay, so this is important. And I think it's especially important in places like the Philippines, where I think there's really a strong thrust right now for increased conservation, increased sort of like focus on nature as well. So things that we observe in Singapore, birds they have many niches in the ecosystem. In many cases, they are fruit dispersers, they're seed dispersers, right? So that's one thing that birds do. They help to spread plants around. And this is great for a city that is trying to become greener, right? If you have birds that are going to help with the seed dispersal, that's also going to help with your goals of making this whole space greener and more habitable for people. Second of all, birds are predators. So in a healthy ecosystem, you get more birds because more predatory birds, for instance, because they are making use of the healthy prey base to get nutrition. So birds are basically a good indication of how healthy your ecosystem already is. So in cases like birds like kingfishers, they occur in places where you have a good prey base of fish. For example, they might be indicators of good aquatic habitats. Same with your white egrets and your herons. Owls, for example, would be indicative of like there being a good number of small rodents as well as like large insects. We know, for instance, that in the greener areas of UP Diliman, there are Philippine scops owl, right, Otis megalotis. And that's a good thing because that shows that there's sort of like multiple tiers in that food web in that area. Besides that, you know, like ecosystem services like seed dispersal and things like that, those are all really, really important in urban areas. More, like I would argue even more so than in some other areas because you have so little natural seed dispersal that's already going on in these urban spaces. So a lot of it has to come from human labor to go plant plants in these specific areas. If birds can help with that, then that's like an added benefit.
This will be the last question that will be entertaining. Considering you have studied both wild and urban species of bird species, would you consider urbanization as a barrier for some species to be genetically isolated in some extent?
Ooh, okay, interesting question. Okay, so first of all, when we talk about isolation in the sense of like things becoming species, speciation, or even incipient speciation, which is like the first stages of things becoming different species, that takes time, right? And that takes a long time. Urbanization is a global phenomenon, and it's something that is a lot more recent than that. But having said that, are there genetic differences in some urban bird populations compared to non-urban bird populations? Are there like actual differences that can be detected? Between these populations, yes, the answer is definitely yes. This is something that has really been documented a lot in North America, for instance. In the US, they found that certain song sparrows, for instance, the urban populations sing differently from the birds elsewhere because there's a lot of urban traffic, right? So what do? They make their songs higher pitched because there's a lot of low pitch noises that's going on in urban areas. So in order to carry better, they make their songs higher pitched. And so when you look at some of these, these urban populations of birds, you do find small variations. Certain consistencies in these urban populations is different from the birds elsewhere. But conversely, if urbanization were to stop right now, if like human beings disappeared off the planet, these urban bird populations would have no trouble interbreeding with and sort of like commingling and sharing genes with the non-urban bird populations as well. So while yes, there definitely is going to be some genetic differences and even some like differences that you can observe in terms of like the size of some birds, the songs of some birds, there's also going to like whether these are like how meaningful these differences are in terms of like species recognition. It's probably not that important, but what it can tell us is that human beings have a irrevocably huge impact in changing animals that live with us, right? And I think that's important to know. We have a huge impact on things, and we should be mindful about that.
To add on to Movin's answer, so what Movin's talking about are commensals. So species that coexist in very much harmony with humans. So things like our sparrows, the Eurasian tree sparrows, and also the house sparrows in some parts of the world. In order to understand whether or not urbanization is actually a barrier that drives some sort of genetic isolation, you need comparisons between the population in the urban areas and also the populations that are outside of these urban areas. So in order for that to happen, you need to have an urban population. Not all birds or animals, in fact, do well in urbanized environments. And so what happens, especially in a city-state like Singapore, that's so highly developed, is fragmentation. So when you have urbanized areas and you have like relatively greener areas, you can have fragmented populations. We have studies by our predecessors in our research group who have identified gene flow corridors, like green corridors where birds use as like a bit like a tunnel to go to each other, like a highway, yeah, to go between populations and promote the gene flow and homogenize these populations. So I would say that it really depends on the life history traits and the kind of animals we're talking about. Some animals do well in urban environments and others do not. So it really depends, yeah, on how urbanization behaves as a selection force on these animals and how they respond to it.
Thank you, Dr. Tan, and thank you, Mr. Movin. I guess that ends our open session forum, and we'll now be moving on to presenting of certificates. So may I call here at the front Ms. Marivin M. Santos, Museum Curator 2 of Zoology Division, and Mr. Rolly Oriza, our Senior Museum Researchers, and of course, our speakers for today. So I read, this certificate of appreciation is hereby given to Mr. Movin Naya Sengeran and Dr. Tan Yen Yi for their invaluable time and effort as a resource person during the activity NMP Talks and Afternoon with NMP Research Collaborators on April 25, 2024 from 1:30 to 5 p.m. via Zoom webinar, given this 25th day of April 2024 at the National Museum of the Philippines, Manila. Signed by Mr. Jeremy R. Barnes, CESO 3, the Director General of the National Museum of the Philippines. Again, may I call Ms. Marivin M. Santos for her closing message.
Hey, hello. What a very enlightening and exciting and engaging lecture by our two presenters, Movin and Dr. Tanyani. And it's really, and I know that our audiences, including me, have learned more of the Philippine biogeography, how species of plants and animals and other life forms are distributed, and how the Philippine geography has influenced that distribution that leads to speciation or the evolution of a species. Well, of course, I was very happy to learn about the experiences of Dr. Tan Yen Lee on her sojourn in bird collecting, and she showed how important the role of natural history museums in documenting and keeping a library of this species. And it is for the world to comprehend and for the scientists and students to go over and thoroughly study the plants and animals or the birds that could or provide insights into what is happening around us in our present world. So by engaging with our researchers and other collaborators around the world, we can both learn the many facets of research and collection management. So on behalf of the management of the National Museum of the Philippines, we greatly appreciate Mr. Movin Yan Sangaran for sharing us with his study on the Philippine biogeography, and Dr. Tan Yen Yi for sharing with us the National University of Singapore's bird collections and its brief history, which could inspire the younger generations to study our natural heritage so that we can all together find a way to protect and conserve them better. Before we all head out, we would like to thank the Robert S. Kennedy Bird Conservancy, the National University of Singapore, and everyone who shared this precious time with us. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Ma'am Vin. So for our Zoom participants, you may open your cam for a quick photo ops. Okay? Okay na. Okay, smile everybody. For our first panel, wala? Okay na? Okay, hold your smiles, guys. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, next panel, please. 1, 2, 3. And for the last panel, 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone. So, okay. That ends our program for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and see you again next time. Please do visit our social media pages, the National Museum of the Philippines in Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to keep you posted in our latest events.